The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 10th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Some Pharisees came, and to test Jesus they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. The Gospel of the Lord. So as the presidential primaries continue to evolve, or more likely perhaps devolve, there is one subject that I am absolutely certain is going to get talked about, but nothing will get done about it. And that is the subject of entitlement reform. When we talk about entitlements in American political speech, it usually means we're talking about stuff like Social Security and Medicare. They're the things that we've all paid for through our payroll taxes, things that we've been promised will be there for us when we get older, things that we're promised that if we're already receiving them, we will continue to be able to count on the fact that they will be there for us. But you know, I think it's sort of strange that we use the word entitlement for these kinds of things, because most of the time when we use the word entitlement in English, it has a kind of arrogant sense to it. It sounds like, you know, we're supposed to get some kind of a special privilege. But with stuff like Social Security and Medicare, almost all of us are willing to use the term entitlement, because whenever I feel like I'm truly entitled to something, it's something that I think, well, you know what, I've paid for it. I've earned it. And almost all the time, if I've paid for something, I figure I deserve it. I'm entitled to it. I really am entitled to it because I paid for it. Sometimes, I feel like I'm entitled to something when I've achieved a certain status. So whether it's I've reached a certain age, or I've reached a certain level of experience and status in my job, I figure, you know, I should be able to expect certain things. And I really do, even if I don't use the word, think, yeah, I'm kind of entitled to it. And I also think that I could be entitled to something if I really actually have some kind of power to enforce my rights. Sometimes there are things that I think I deserve, but I can't really affect the outcome. I can't really enforce my rights. But if I can enforce my rights, then I've got the power to be entitled to something, as my new pen pals remind me all the time, ever since last month when I turned 50. I start getting letters every couple of weeks from AARP, and they remind me that, you know, voting blocks are important. They have power, and you're now part of this group because you have reached this age. But, you know, when you have power, you think you got some entitlement. And whenever the things that we really truly feel that we're entitled to are kind of in question or in jeopardy, it makes us rightly nervous. We're not sure we like to hear that things that we think we should be entitled to maybe are going to not be there for us. I bring this up because the conversations that Jesus is having with people in today's gospel reading really are a conversation about entitlements. Not Social Security and Medicare, but the entitlement to feel that you deserve or have earned or are entitled to God's love, inclusion in God's kingdom, a sense of standing before God with a feeling of, I'm really righteous enough to be here. Although it is phrased in the context of a question about marriage and divorce. What the Pharisees are really doing when they come to Jesus is to say, hey, if people got married and divorced, is there a loophole, not just with marriage and divorce, but with lots of stuff, by which we might say, that really doesn't count. That really doesn't stand in the way of our being able to stand up in front of God and say, you know what, I'm still entitled to be here. I'm still entitled to a sense of righteousness and to inclusion in God's kingdom. I'm really entitled where other people are not. That's really the context of this question, because everybody knew the answer. Jesus knew the answer. The Pharisees knew the answer. The Old Testament, even when it lifts up marriage as an indissoluble and permanent kind of relationship, even then set up processes and procedures and rules for when marriage didn't work. So Jesus' answer really didn't change or say anything new. Jesus reinforces God's hope for loyalty and commitment and permanence in all human relationships. He acknowledges the pain and the brokenness that nevertheless happen in many human relationships. He calls the pain and the brokenness sin. And notice that he does not do what the Pharisees want him to do, is lift up divorce as the worst sin or an unforgivable sin. But what Jesus does do is that he refuses to sweep the pain and the brokenness under the rug and say, oh, there are certain things, and you can just pretend they didn't happen, and act like you're still entitled to something in front of God. Because what the Pharisees were really looking for was the loopholes, the sense that somehow or other, my sin really doesn't count, so that I can continue to live with this sense of entitlement before God. So what Jesus is really doing in today's gospel reading is, in a sense, entitlement reform. That is, he's challenging every sense of human entitlement to God's love, to inclusion in God's kingdom, and to a sense of personal righteousness. Because people then, and now, even when we don't want to admit it, often live with kind of a pretty big sense of entitlement when it comes to God and to righteousness. Sometimes that sense of entitlement comes from the feeling that, we've earned a certain place in God's kingdom because we've done the right things, or at least we haven't done the really bad things. And then we decide which are the really good things and which are the really bad things. Which is why you hear all these people that stand up and say, yes, as a Christian I need to say, all Christians are sinners. I have been a sinner. I have sinned. This is true. But the thing is, my sin, it wasn't a big sin. And if it was, I've properly repented from it. So I'm okay, but you, on the other hand, I'm not so sure about you. And that's the kind of game playing with who's really entitled to forgiveness and righteousness that the Pharisees are playing. And that's the kind of entitlement that Jesus wants nothing to do with. Sometimes we have a sense of personal entitlement to God's love because we think somehow or other we have achieved a certain status. Because you come to church every week and we say, you know what? You are people of God. And it's true. But down deep I think, well, yeah, I'm part of the people of God because you and me, what's not to love about us? We're nice people. And, some few of us are a little bit, overtired because we've been on confirmation retreat and a little grumpy and stuff some of the time. But by and large, we're people that are trying and we got a certain status, and that should earn us something in front of God, right? That is the sort of sense of entitlement that Jesus wants nothing to do with. Sometimes deep down, we have this sense of entitlement because we have this delusional belief that somehow, even though we get the relationship with God by grace and all that stuff, and we say, okay, yeah, God gave me this relationship because of grace, but somehow or other, even if I can't actually make it happen, I can influence it by what I do. I got the power to change it, modify it, move it along. I can change my behavior. I can pray harder and louder. I can at least make myself look better, and somehow or other, that should be able to change the course and the direction of my relationship with God so that I can sort of stand in front of God and say, well, at least I'm a little bit entitled to being able to say I'm part of God's family and I'm somebody God loves. And it's against all of these thoughts on entitlement that Jesus wants nothing to do with. So he takes this little child and he sets the child in the midst of the disciples, and he says to them and he says to us, whoever doesn't receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. But what does it mean to be somebody who receives the kingdom of God as a little child? Sometimes when we read things in the Bible about little children, we create these ideas in our minds about, oh, little children are sweet and pure and innocent, unless I'm sweet and pure and innocent. The thing is, that was not the worldview of children in the first century. It was not the context in which Jesus spoke these words. Jesus spoke these words in a context in which children had absolutely no way to earn anything, which is still the case. Everything the child has, the child receives because of the love and the care of the parents. The parents want the child to have it, and that's why the child gets it. Even when the child is being good and sweet and pure and doing the chores, that's not why you feed them and house them and take care of them. Children exist because of the love and mercy of the parent. And that's the kind of thing that you stand in front of God with. An understanding that you haven't earned God's love. God's given it to you because that's the way God is. It has nothing to do with the way you are. Jesus speaks these words in a context in which a child had absolutely no status. There was no legal status for a child. A child was really worth nothing until the child became of age. So even the disciples, the good guys in the story, criticize people who are bringing children to Jesus because, as far as the disciples are concerned, the children have no status. They don't count. Jesus grabs one of these non-status people, puts them in the midst, and says, that's exactly the point. The people who don't have the right status count in God's eyes. That's what it means to live without a sense of entitlement. And Jesus speaks these words in a context in which children in the first century had absolutely no power to enforce their rights. You notice we still don't let them vote. And in the first century, there was nobody even had a sense of universal human rights that all people, even little children, were entitled to. So the only way that a child was going to continue to live safely and in security was out of the love, the mercy, the compassion of the parents. Not because the child screamed loud enough to make the parent do it. That's what it means to live without a sense of entitlement. And that really is Jesus' point in both of these conversations, both the one on marriage and divorce and the one about the children. This is the great thing about Jesus' entitlement reform. You don't get in and you don't stay in the kingdom of God by any kind of entitlement or any kind of sense of entitlement. Instead, you can only receive the kingdom by the love, the mercy, and the power of God. The last night we had a baptism of an infant, and it was a really great experience, and I said to them, sometimes when we bring an infant to be baptized, they say, oh, it's great, it's a sign of God's love, because, here's this little infant who's earned nothing, has no status, has no power, and they're receiving God's love, and that's great for that infant. But then we start to think, as we get older, we should follow God's commands, and we should do all this stuff, and that's it. The fact of the matter is, just like an infant at the font, that's how we stand before God each and every day, no matter what our age, no matter what our status, no matter what we've done or not done. We're all people who stand at the door of the kingdom of God and are invited in, which has nothing to do with our earning it, our status, our power to control it. It's all because of God's love, God's mercy, and God's desire to include us. Jesus' entitlement reform finally means that you get God's love, even though you can't earn it. You get to be part of the kingdom of God, even though you don't have the right status. And you stay in the kingdom of God, not because you have the power to do the right thing or avoid the wrong thing, but because of the greater power of God's love and God's mercy and God's forgiveness.